According to the Bible, Jesus of Nazareth had two different grandfathers. Not two grandfathers because families are complicated. Two different men on the exact same side of the family, named by two different gospel writers, in two documents that are both supposedly telling us the truth about the same bloodline. One says Joseph's father was a man named Jacob. The other says his father was a man named Heli. For skeptics, this isn't a footnote, it's Exhibit A. The first hard contradiction you hit reading the New Testament in order on page 1 before Jesus says a single word. So today, we're opening the file on it. And the real answer is stranger, older, and more clever than the Bible just messed up. It involves a widow, a legal loophole 1,000 years older than Jesus, and a detail sitting in verse 27 that almost nobody stops to notice. Welcome back to Prophecy Files, where we treat the Bible's hardest questions like a cold case and follow the evidence wherever it goes. Today's file, the family tree of Jesus. Let's open it. Only 2 of the 4 Gospels bother giving Jesus a genealogy at all, Matthew and Luke. On the surface, that's great news. 2 independent writers, 2 confirmations of the same bloodline, case closed before we even start. Except they don't match. Matthew starts at Abraham and counts forward generation by generation, 42 names deep. Right near the end, he writes this: Joseph's father, according to Matthew, Jacob. Luke tells the same story backward, starting at Jesus and counting up through more than 70 names, all the way to Adam. Right at the top of his list, he writes this: Joseph's father, according to Luke, Heli, Jacob. Heli, same Joseph, 2 different dads. And it's not an isolated glitch. Trace both trees further back, and the whole branch is different. Both lines run through King David. Good, that's consistent. But they run through 2 different sons of David. Matthew goes through Solomon, the famous one, the temple builder. Luke goes through Nathan, a completely different son of David you probably never heard a sermon about. So somewhere between King David and Joseph, these 2 family trees stop being the same family tree. Here's why this isn't just Bible trivia. This is load-bearing. The entire messianic case for Jesus depends on him coming from David's bloodline. Not spiritually, not in a manner of speaking, literally, genetically, David's line. God's promise to David wasn't vague. Your offspring, forever, on the throne. Centuries later, Isaiah pictures the Messiah as a shoot growing directly out of the stump of Jesse, David's own father. Jeremiah calls him a righteous branch, raised up specifically for David's house. This isn't a minor prophetic detail you can round off. Davidic descent isn't a bonus feature for the Messiah. It's the entry requirement, which means if the only 2 genealogies the Bible gives us for Jesus can't even agree on his grandfather's name, that's not a footnote. That's potentially the whole case falling apart on page 1. So let's dig in, because it turns out this exact objection is nearly 2,000 years old. And so is the answer. Before we call this hopeless, look closer. Both lists do something strange at almost the exact same point in history. Fast forward from David to the Babylonian exile, around 586 B.C. Matthew's line passes through a father and son named Salathiel and Zorobabel. Now check Luke's line at the same historical moment, running through what's supposed to be a totally different branch of David's family. Same 2 names, same order, showing up in 2 family trees that are supposedly running through 2 different sons of David the entire time. Historians are honestly split on this one. Some think it's just two very common names in post-exilic Judea, turning up twice by coincidence. Fair. But if you're building a case file, you don't ignore a coincidence like that. You flag it and keep digging. And when you dig, it turns out the early church already dug into this exact problem, almost 2,000 years before it ever became a favorite talking point in modern skeptical books. Around the year 200 A.D., a historian named Julius Africanus set out to solve this exact contradiction. His claimed source, genealogical records kept by Jesus' own surviving relatives, people who'd have every reason to know. The church historian Eusebius later preserved his answer, word for word, in his ecclesiastical history. Here's the theory. Two men, Mathan, descended from Solomon's branch, and Melchi, descended from Nathan's branch, married the same woman named Esther, one after the other. Mathan married her first. They had a son, Jacob. Then Mathan died. By custom, Esther remarried, this time to Melchi. They had a son of their own, Heli. Same mother, two different fathers, two different branches of David's family. Jacob and Heli grow up as half-brothers. Here's where it gets clever. Heli grows up, marries, and dies without a son. Under the law of Moses, that triggers something specific. You've actually already seen this custom play out once before. It's the same principle behind the book of Ruth, when Boaz steps in as next of kin to marry Ruth and preserve her dead husband's line. So Jacob marries Heli's widow. Their son is Joseph, which makes Joseph simultaneously, biologically, the son of Jacob, Solomon's branch, exactly what Matthew records, and legally, by name and inheritance, the son of Heli, Nathan's branch, exactly what Luke records. Two Gospels, two grandfathers, one Joseph, standing with a foot in both family trees, because in Jewish law, father was never as simple as the man whose blood you carry. It could also mean the man whose name and inheritance you legally carry forward. To be fair to the skeptics, some later scholars pushed back on this exact mechanism, pointing out that Old Testament levirate law technically covers brothers through the same father, not half-brothers who only share a mother. That's a real objection worth knowing exists. But even critics of the precise legal detail generally accept the core shape of the solution. Ancient Jewish genealogies routinely track two different kinds of fatherhood, natural and legal, and Joseph is Exhibit A of exactly that. Here's a second theory, in some forms older than Africanus, and today probably the most common answer you'll hear from a pulpit. What if Luke was never giving us Joseph's genealogy at all? What if he's giving us Mary's? I know what you're thinking. Luke's text literally says, Joseph, son of Heli. Fair objection. But look at the actual Greek behind that English sentence. In the original Greek, the word for son only appears once in Luke's entire genealogy. In verse 23, describing Joseph. Every link after that, Heli, of Mathat, of Levi, of Melchi, isn't son of in the Greek at all. It's just the word of, repeated generation after generation. English translators added the words, the son themselves, in italics, to make it readable. Luke's original Greek is actually far looser than the English makes it sound, and of is exactly flexible enough to include a son-in-law. That's not a stretch. It's a documented habit in Hebrew culture. In 1 Samuel, King Saul looks at David, his own son-in-law, married to his daughter Michal, and calls him my son David, out loud, on the record. So here's theory 2, laid out. Matthew gives us Joseph's actual line. His legal claim to David's throne exactly what a Jewish audience reading Matthew's Gospel would care about most. Luke gives us Mary's actual line and lists her husband Joseph as of Heli, the way you or I might say, my son-in-law, without a second thought. Because ancient genealogies, for reasons that have nothing to do with the sexism we'd recognize today, simply didn't write women's names into the family tree. Which means, if this theory's right, Jesus doesn't just have a legal claim to David's throne through his adoptive father. He has an actual biological blood claim to David's throne through his mother. Here's the honest answer. Nobody can prove it with total certainty. These are historical reconstructions of family relationships from 2,000-year-old documents, and neither the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, nor Protestant scholarship has ever officially settled on one over the other. Some scholars, most prominently the New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, argue this is simply an unresolved contradiction, and that trying to harmonize it forces the text to say more than it actually says. That's a fair objection to sit with. But notice what both leading theories actually have in common. And this is the twist. Whether the answer is Joseph had a natural father and a legal father, or one genealogy is Joseph's, the other is Mary's, either way, the result is the same. Jesus ends up with two independent, differently purposed roads back to King David, not zero. A single tidy genealogy would actually be the boring outcome here. What we've got instead is two documents, written by two different authors for two different audiences that don't just repeat each other, they reinforce each other from two completely different angles. There's one more piece of this that skeptics and defenders actually agree on. Neither genealogy was ever built like a modern legal document. Matthew tells you this himself. 14, 14, 14. Not a coincidence. In Hebrew, letters double as numbers, and the letters that spell David add up to exactly 14. Matthew is telling you, in code, on every line, this is David's family. Look how David this is. To make that structure work, Matthew skips several known generations that show up elsewhere in the Old Testament record. That's not fraud. It's just how ancient genealogies were written. Begat didn't always mean the very next generation. Once you know that's the genre you're reading, the entire contradiction starts looking less like sloppy record-keeping and more like two writers making careful, deliberate choices about which David's family story they wanted to tell. So, back to where we started. Jesus had two different grandfathers. On paper, in practice, he had one Joseph, standing at the meeting point of two Davidic bloodlines, backed by two gospel writers who were never trying to write the same document twice. The prophet said the Messiah had to come from David's line. They never said there'd only be one road to prove it. As it turns out, there were two, hiding in plain sight since Matthew chapter 1, verse 16. That's the file on Jesus' two grandfathers, closed for now until the next mystery reopens it. If this kind of investigation is your thing, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next file.